Before we begin, the disclaimer, the purpose of this presentation is not to give financial product advice. If any financial product advice is given in the presentation, the standard disclaimers that it is general advice only apply. That is, it has been prepared without taking into account any person's objectives, financial situation or needs, and therefore you should consider the appropriateness of the advice in light of your own situation and requirements. Okay, that's out of the way. Today, we're very fortunate to have two experienced biotech executives, Dr. Nina Webster and Dr. Matthias Smith. Dr. Nina Webster has over 25 years of global experience in both biotechnology and pharmaceuticals, with nearly 15 years of that in senior executive roles. Dr. Webster was Commercial Director of Acrax Limited before being appointed as CEO at Dimerix in 2018. Dimerix currently has its proprietary product DMX-200 in multiple clinical development programs: diabetic kidney disease, focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, and acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is in the press a lot lately in COVID-19 patients. Each of these is a potentially transformational program in its own right, and DMX-700 is also in preclinical testing for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And I presume we'll hear more about that later. Nina? Dr. Matthias Smith, after many years as a sell-side, and he can tell us how many years, I presume it's a lot, as a sell-side analyst covering life science companies. Matthias is now a director at Crucible Investments, Pty Ltd, providing advisory services on investor communications, strategy and capital markets for emerging and established Australian life science companies. So we'll be discussing 2020, the year that was, and what we can expect in 2021. And both Nina and Matthias will be more than happy to take your questions later. So please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen down the bottom, I think, anytime, and we will address as many of those as possible after we answer the pre-submitted questions. But first we'll do Matt on the Horizon, where I comment on some of the important developments impacting our sector and thus investment objectives. You guys still see me? My screen changed considerably. Matthias and Nina, you're all
yes, can see you, no problem.
Yep, okay, that's good. Thank you. So let's start off looking at one of the big share price movers, Rhythm Biosciences, the predictive diagnostics company that has just about quadrupled its share price as it has completed and delivered superior performance from its Cholestat prototype test kit, designed to provide early detection of colorectal cancer. It then, last week, announced that it had completed another step on the pathway to bringing its product to the market, appointing a manufacturer of the Cholestat test kit. It's expected that small-scale manufacturing will have commenced by the end of 2020 calendar year. That's in the next couple of weeks, I presume. Telix Pharmaceuticals, whose CEO, Dr. Chris Behrenbruch, joined us on an earlier episode of this webinar, announced at the end of last month the $33 million Australian acquisition of TheraPharm, Swiss-German biotechnology company developing diagnostic and therapeutic solutions in the area of hematology. It's a move that provides Telix with access to a portfolio of patents, technologies, production systems, clinical data and know-how in the use of molecularly targeted radiation in hematology and immunology. And the COVID-19 vaccine has also stayed firmly in the spotlight again, with the UK getting ready to roll out Pfizer's BioNTech vaccine this week. Closer to home, Australia's Dimerix last week announced that its lead candidate, DMX-200, had been included in a second international study evaluating it as a potential treatment for respiratory complications associated with COVID-19. The phase 3 study, Clarity 2.0, led by Professor Meg Jardine from the University of Sydney, will recruit COVID-19 patients at an early stage of respiratory complications prior to the onset of acute respiratory distress syndrome, more from Nina soon, hopefully. We've also had further focus on research and development funding from government. Last episode, our news summary included the federal government's budget announcement that it'll deliver a boost to help commercialise life-saving medical discoveries. Now we have also been told the Victorian government will be fronting up with a $2 billion over 10 years for Breakthrough Victoria Fund to drive further investment in the research and development sector. Now we just have to see where it will be spent. Finally, overseas investment bank activity. Health tech transactions are on the rise. First half of 2020 was back to the peak levels seen 5 years ago. E-health M&A activity has increased significantly in third quarter 2020. We all know that telehealth and telemedicine has really taken off thanks to COVID. And investment bank Jefferies reported that there has been 16 SPAC healthcare transactions thus far in 2020. SPAC, or Special Purpose Acquisition Company, is a blank check shell corporation designed to take companies public without going through the traditional IPO process. SPACs allow retail investors to invest in private equity type transactions, particularly leveraged buyouts. So now to our panelists. Nina, if I can start with you. At the start of 2020, how would you have characterised expectations for the year ahead?
Yes, thank you, Matt. So 2020 was shaping up to be a transformational year for us here at Dimerix. At the start of the year, we had 2 phase 2 clinical studies in 2 different indications that we were expecting to read out middle of the year. Fortunately, we've ended the year really strongly. We've got 3 different products entering phase 3 clinical studies, as well as a 4th product in phase 2 and a 5th in preclinical. I know you touched on some of this earlier on. As a bit of a background, we are a listed company. We have a platform technology that looks at the activity of drugs at the receptor level. Using our proprietary platform technology, we identified a number of high unmet need and commercially attractive opportunities. And at the start of 2020, we were actively developing our own product candidates, with 2 candidates, as I said, in phase 2. The first for focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, or FSGS, and Matt, you said that beautifully earlier on, which is a rare kidney disease, and for diabetic kidney disease. And then we had 1 candidate in preclinical development for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So at the beginning of 2020, having met with the FDA at the end of 2019, we were planning for the completion of those 2 phase 2 clinical studies, which we expected to complete mid-20. We were also undertaking certain time-critical activities to ensure the progression into the next steps towards commercialization, such as manufacturing supply, preparing for an IND, and the regulatory authority and equivalents such as FDA. So as with everyone else across the sector, we've been severely tested across all of those areas as a result of the pandemic. And we were extremely pleased to see that our systems and processes have adapted to the evolving and very challenging environment that we've seen, as well as create some new product opportunities in the COVID-19 treatment area, which I think we'll touch on shortly as well. So yes, it was a big year, big expectation for us.
And I might just note in our preamble before we went live, I noticed that you said your team had geared up to working from home previously. That was very well planned, very fortuitous, and I'm guessing it's gone very smoothly.
Absolutely. We were very lucky. We had already set up the majority of our team working from home for certain days of the week. So we were very well equipped to move forward in that process as well. Yeah.
Well done. Okay. So ultimately, though 2020 was a year like no other, what speed bumps did you see across the sector, and which of those did Dimerix encounter, and how were these handled?
Yeah, I think we're all familiar with companies in the sector that had their clinical trials cancelled or paused during COVID-19 lockdowns, or laboratory activities placed on hold. Regulatory submissions have been delayed. And of course, all of these add time and cost, which has been problematic. Many of the companies that we're aware of have had to cut staff hours, etc., as a result of this. And I know that many have struggled across the sector one of, I think, the competing factors there was that many of us were not eligible for the JobKeeper support program because most of us are not profitable, so didn't meet that threshold. So added cost and time, but no support. In light of COVID-19, fortunately, we had clinical studies underway, and we implemented a number of contingency plans in the event that clinical study participants were required to self-isolate or visits to these medical institutions were restricted. And since all of our clinical sites for both of our study were in Australia, we were very fortunate because we had the ability to monitor those study sites very closely. Fortunately, our team running the studies had the foresight to start implementing a risk mitigation strategy in February. And those strategies were utilized successfully. And as a result, we were very fortunate that we remained on track, and we reported top-line data for the phase 2 program in FSGS in July 2020 and positive top-line data for the diabetic kidney disease in September 2020. So throughout 2020, we've also been preparing for a pivotal phase 3 program in FSGS, which we initiated a feasibility study in March 2020 and concluded in August. Now that's a paperwork exercise, and that assesses which sites could recruit FSGS patients, in which country, how many patients each of those sites could recruit. And that informs us how many sites overall we're likely to require to conduct the study. Now, given this was run during 2020 and through the pandemic, it's meant that we have already taken into account COVID-19, which gives us an advantage moving into 2021 and where we can recruit these patients. I guess the other challenge, and we touched on this earlier, was the working from home remotely. As we spoke a moment ago, we were very fortunate that we were already set up to work from home, and we are in a position to successfully work from home. However, as with the rest of Victoria and the sector, juggling the different priorities, including homeschooling, and building new relationships with online portals and business development has certainly been a huge challenge for us. So I think across the sector, actually, I'm proud of the whole sector. We have all learned to think and act very differently in the new and flexible working environment. So we are continuing to meet those challenges head on.
Well, congratulations. It sounds like you've had a very productive year given the challenges. So that's a real credit to you and your team. Matthias, what did you see as the speed bumps emerging across our sector?
Look, it was reassuring to hear what Nina said, and we hadn't rehearsed this because it was very much in line with my thinking. I think actually while the pandemic was clearly, very difficult, I think the biotech sector actually had a relatively good pandemic. There were the hardships that Nina touched on, issues of managing staff for those companies that have sales. They were declining, although I suspect for some that was an opportunity to hide a multiple of sins. There were certainly challenges around suspending clinical trials, disruptions to research, manufacturing, all of these things that we're aware of. But I think, really the sector shone in how it handled those, and maybe it's a reflection of the fact that the biotech sector is very risky, and you do need to manage, you need to be very adaptable. And I think that came through with the response of companies. We saw all companies across the board manage to reduce their costs very promptly and very responsibly, because we, if nothing, know how precious cash is and how difficult it is when you don't get it. Companies were very proactive in access and support capital. They tapped into the market where possible to war chest to get through this period, and the market was pretty receptive. They adapted their technology, replaced travel with Zoom, and I think probably the one thing that we all saw was it's possible to do things a lot easier and a lot more efficiently, although you do get kind of sick of your computer. I think if you look at what happened, really across the sector, with all these hardships and adaptability, there was extraordinary progress made in a number of programs never would have thought would be possible in that situation. I think the upside that we got from the pandemic is we certainly learned we can do things a lot more efficiently. We really, without a doubt, lifted awareness for the importance of medical research, life science products, and the opportunities that they can provide commercially and returns for investors. And I think, we have right now probably the strongest support I've seen from the capital markets for the sector for many, many years. So look, it hasn't been a really, really tough year for a lot of people, but I think if you look at the balance of things, the life sciences sector came out extraordinarily well from those circumstances.
Yeah, it's when the whole pandemic thing started. I remember, I forget where it was, but it stuck in my mind and said, "This is the biotech sector's time to shine." And what both of you have said has actually borne that out. I mean, this is back in April or something, so it's gone a lot further and longer than any I certainly expected. And I'm about to use a word that people are probably sick of hearing, but I'm going to ask Matthias first. You've talked about some of the speed bumps and all that, and you have actually talked about some of the upsides, but what COVID pivot pivot opportunities did you both see and encounter?
Look, I think the last few months has really highlighted how infectious this virus is, because in January we talked about it. By April, it turned up in quite a few company presentations, and by May, I think 50% of the companies were infected with the COVID program somehow. So, it really did attract a lot of innovation and opportunism. It was, quite remarkable, given it takes 5 to 10 years to develop a product, that everyone kind of pivoted into a disease that had been around for a few months. But to be fair, we had a lot of companies that are involved in some very sophisticated programs. We have a number of companies that are involved in diagnostics and infectious disease control. And so, some of those turned technology to this new opportunity. Others, I think, were clearly, jumping on the bandwagon, but that's the way of the world. And I think you have to be adaptable. And if there are opportunities like that, you're crazy not to grab them if everyone else is grabbing them.
And Nina, COVID pivot opportunities?
Yes, fortunately, despite the challenges in 2020, the year has actually provided Dimerix with some real opportunity as well. So without going into the science specifically, we know that our drug works in kidney disease by reducing damage in the inflammatory cells. And we know that our clinical data supports that mechanism of action. We also understand that in COVID-19, respiratory complications are caused by that immune response and inflammatory response to the virus, where that immune system overreacts and it results in respiratory failure and death in some instances. And that's why our lead candidate, DMX-200, is now part of 2 different phase 3 clinical studies in COVID-19 patients with different respiratory complications. So firstly, our candidate has been included in a REMAP-CAP global study in acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS, in those patients with COVID-19. Now, that's a study that is endorsed by the WHO. It has been initiated in over 260 clinical sites in 19 different countries and intends on recruiting over 7,000 patients overall. So a fantastic study to be involved in, for which we were also recently awarded a $1 million grant from the Australian government, from the Medical Research Futures Fund, towards our inclusion in that REMAP-CAP study. And that's something we're very pleased with, as that funding and endorsement is a strong reflection on the scientific rationale for DMX-200 in that indication. And then more recently, earlier in the week, actually last Monday, we announced that we've also been included in a large 600-patient phase 3 study led by Professor Meg Jardine, as you mentioned, in a study called Clarity 2.0. And this will recruit COVID-19 patients at an earlier stage of respiratory complications. So it's prior to the onset of respiratory disease, acute respiratory distress syndrome, in the REMAP-CAP study. So essentially, if we can reduce the inflammation or reduce the damage caused by that virus, we may be able to reduce the severity and duration of symptoms of COVID-19 and potentially reduce the long-term impact and health burden post-hospitalization that some of these patients are suffering as well. So a really big opportunity. We started the year with 2 phase 2 clinical opportunities, and we finished the year with 3 phase 3 opportunities, 1 phase 2 opportunity, and a preclinical opportunity. So yes, we have been very fortuitous.
Oh, once again, well done. And so, Nina, do your clinical studies have potential ramifications beyond COVID-19?
Yeah, so historically, pandemics have lasted 12 to 36 months, and unfortunately, we've seen a number of those resurgences globally right now. So it's really pleasing to see that some of the vaccines have made real progress. However, we also recognise that it's going to take some time for these to reach the global population. So whilst COVID-19 is likely to be around for a while yet, if DMX-200 does show benefit in the respiratory complications associated with COVID-19, it may also show benefit in respiratory complications associated with other infections too, such as pneumonia and influenza. And that provides a real opportunity that could extend well beyond COVID-19.
Okay, thank you. And Matthias, now looking to the year ahead, what themes have you seen emerging that you think will be important for biotech investors in 2021?
Look, I have to say, Matt, I'm not a big fan of thematic investing. I kind of tend to see that, you know, investments should be driven by the fundamentals of interesting products, good technologies, and good market opportunities. However, having said that, you know, as a public company, you need to be very aware of the trends that are, or the investor sentiments that are happening in the sector, because ultimately they can drive more the share price than anything else. So it is important. But one thing I would say is, and I've said this during the course of this, I do think the sector is actually in the strongest state it's been for some time. Certainly the market sentiment and support is extremely positive. We have a number of companies which are getting good commercial traction with their products and generating, you know, strong sales growth. And as you've said, you know, there are more sources of funding, including government funding, that can support these. So, you know, we're going into 2021, a very robust sector. I think probably the thing that I find most reassuring is the structure of the sector. The diversity of companies that we have is like we've never seen before. You know, when I started, you know, many years ago, I don't know how many, in the life sciences sector, it wasn't really, biotech was drug discovery and nothing else. And drug discovery has a couple of things associated with it. One is long timeline with high risk and a lot of cash going into them, and then a binary outcome. What we're looking at now is quite a diversity of device companies, drug companies, diagnostic companies. We really have them across the spectrum, from really interesting early stage companies to much later stage market rollout, market share grabbing companies. And I think, you know, if you look at the market caps previously, the structure of the sector, it's always had a long tail, but it typically had one or two companies that were worth more than $1 billion, and a whole bunch that were worth less than about 100 million, and not a hell of a lot in between. What we're now seeing is really much more of, I guess what I'd say is less of a rat's tail and more of a kangaroo tail, where we've kind of got a bit more of a bit of a decline on the curve. So I think the sector is you know, looking in great shape for the next year. What the thematics will be, you know, whether it will be people, you know, jumping on more COVID opportunities or winding some of them back and refocusing on what they were doing before. Whether it is, you know, product launches that have, you know, to be honest, had a mixed bag in the market. We've had some companies that have launched products and gone very well, others that look like great products that have taken an extremely long time to generate the sales momentum. I'm not sure, but you know, I think there's many places where we will see growth just because we have such a diversity of companies out there right now. And I think 2021 should be a pretty strong year, pending any sort of awful second pandemic coming through.
Yeah, or third wave in Victoria's case.
Yeah. Oh, no, thank you. No,
so
thank
Nina,
you.
Nina, what are you seeing as key factors of the Australian biotech sector 2021, and specifically, how do they factor into your thinking at Dimerix?
Yeah, so I agree with Matthias entirely. I think that in Australia, we are uniquely positioned for growth in the biotech sector, given our low COVID-19 infection rates. So we have access to laboratories, testing and clinical units in Australia. It's largely unimpeded. and is almost getting back to business as usual, notwithstanding the difficult period we did face here in Victoria. So given the data from studies conducted in Australia is widely accepted by regulatory agencies globally, and the fact that institutions, including hospitals, are now starting to allow these on-site visits for their patients, Australia could be really well placed to be a leading country in getting the biotech studies up and running again. I mentioned before we completed a feasibility study through 2020, and as such, we understand where we can recruit the patients globally for that FSGS study, despite COVID-19 as well. I think the other thing which we've touched on earlier on is this the move to reduced interstate and international travel. I think that will stay with us for certainly the foreseeable future, but maybe even indefinitely. For the most part, we have become very accustomed to the online meetings. I mean, we're all far more time efficient, but of course it actually does reduce overheads as well, which is also a good thing. So as I suspect that even when we see COVID-19 in the rearview mirror, hopefully that will be closer than not, many of these interactions I think will remain online. So as much as 2020 was a big year for Dimerix, 2021 is shaping up to be even bigger. In terms of DMX-200 in the renal studies, we expect to file an IND and initiate the FSGS studies in the first half of 2021. In parallel, we anticipate that efficacy data for DMX-200 in respiratory complications with COVID-19 also available mid-2021, as well as progressing the manufacturing scale-up regulatory activities and moving DMX-700 towards the clinic as well for the chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So we continue to engage with potential licensing partners, albeit online, which is a separate challenge. And so we aim to provide that best outcome for the patients and for the shareholders. So watch this space.
Nina, your comment about other companies moving their clinical trials to Australia has prompted a question, and that is that we're all seeing this, and just wondering whether that is going to put any pressure on enrolment or investigators. Do either of you have a view on that?
I think that's only a good thing, though. I think we have a fantastic capability here in Australia for clinical trial setup. The phase 1, phase 2 units are quite exceptional. So I think that's certainly a good thing. Depending on when you talk about pressure and competing, it very much depends on which area you're recruiting for. Dimerix, we're actually engaged in areas that have a very high unmet need with little competition. So we don't expect a huge impact for Dimerix specifically.
Yeah. And last question, lucky last for you, Matthias. Specifically, what is exciting you at the moment in the listed market and maybe the unlisted? So we might get a heads up and make lots of money, because most of these people on this webinar are investors. So here's your time to shine.
Okay.
Thank you for not wearing a loud shirt for a change.
I'm actually already regretting it. I should have got one of my Hawaiian numbers out for this. But as you said, this is an investment advice. But look, there's a couple of the earlier stage companies that I've ended up working in, which I couldn't do as a sell side analyst because it's very hard to justify the time and effort in providing coverage on an early stage company. But two of the companies that I've been working with, one is Amplia, which has been a lot of fun for me this year. Extraordinary experience around the management team and board, and just started a phase 1 clinical trial of their drug in healthy volunteers. Reason I'm excited about that company is firstly the experience which I've witnessed firsthand in my dealings with them, but also I think one of the things that the sector typically struggles with is the long and expensive timelines, and Amplia is looking at completing their phase 1 trial early next year and starting phase 2 programs towards the end of next year, and that's the type of momentum that's going to lead to some serious share price appreciation. We've already seen the stock price go up 4 times in the time I've been working for the company, so that's been a lot of fun to work with. Also doing a little bit of work with Patras, which I have a long history with. In fact, I was the first float I was involved in at Lodge Partners about 15 years ago, and An idea of, and that wasn't my first sell side gig, by the way, but it was a long time ago. The company is really, what they're dealing with now has nothing to do with that technology. It's an interesting technology they've got out of Yale, and part of my role has been trying to translate that into a language that investors could understand, because it was a very often heavy scientific presentation that, to be honest, I even struggled with a few of the slides. Once I got my head around it, I thought, actually, this is really, really interesting. So those are good. You mentioned Telix, which are, I've got a lot of admiration for Chris. I think he has put a few noses out of joint. Possibly we needed some of that. But, what he has achieved in that company and the types of deals we're seeing being, something the sector really hasn't seen enough of. And it's great to see that happening. Nanosonics, which I started covering soon after it floated in 2006, under the stewardship of Michael Kavanagh, has been just a really terrific story. Again, nicely positioned in infection control. Ironically, as probably one of the leading infection control companies, they didn't make a big selling price out of COVID, but I can tell you the need for that type of products and the solutions they're delivering, I think are going to set them in good stead for many, many years to come. But it's, to be honest, there's a plethora of great stories out there. I've mentioned 4, but I think there are many, many others. And as always, there's a few that hopefully won't carry on for too much longer, because they're probably more involved in keeping people's jobs and producing shareholder value. But that's the nature of any emerging sector.
Okay, thank you both very much. Look, we'll have to wind it up there now. It's beyond 11:30, our prescribed time. The next webinar will be early in the new year. So here's to a more predictable 2021. Thank you to the audience. Your feedback and suggestions are most welcome. If you feel we can improve or have a suggestion for content, please don't hesitate to email me on matt@horizon3biotech.com. Thanks go to FB Rice and Monsoon Communications for sponsoring and hosting this webinar. And finally, thank you to Nina and Matthias for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Very much appreciated. See you all again in 2021, and happy holidays and summer, and stay safe. Thanks, guys.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.